Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be my wildcard draft for Matchday 5. Now, for Matchday 5, I personally am not going to be using a wildcard. I plan to use my wildcard in the semifinals because there were not enough upsets for me to really pull the trigger on a Matchday 5 wildcard. For other people who have invested into teams like Italy, for example, teams like, let's say, Austria, if you've overinvested into such teams, or maybe you have some issues with your drafts, let's say you have Guehi who's suspended, you might have other issues in your team. For example, in my own team, I've got Pedri, who I think is a bit of a problem child. If you have issues like that and you've got maybe 5 or 6 transfers that you really want to do, I do think it does make sense to consider wildcarding in Matchday 5. But that's really up to, the size of the issues in your team and whether you want to do so. Let's quickly just discuss the logic of a Matchday 5 wildcard. So one of the most interesting things that has happened today with Turkey beating Austria and also the Dutch winning very convincingly versus Romania is it does seem like, at least, according to a lot of statistical websites, we can see that there's a little bit of a favoring of teams like Netherlands and England. So that's that side of the bracket, which is, quote unquote, easier. And then obviously the bracket that has Spain, Germany, Portugal, France is very, very close. A lot of the matchups are close to 50-50s, right? So if you sort of were thinking about what team to invest into, it does still make sense to invest into the Dutch and the English teams. Now, England obviously played a horrific game of football, and arguably over the course of this tournament, you can say the same about practically every match they've played. And I can understand someone who doesn't want to invest into English players. At the same time, I'll still say for the most part, they have defended quite well, with exception to the last game. And Switzerland, of course, absolutely blew apart Italy. But I don't think we should necessarily just 100% believe that England will get knocked out that easily. For whatever reason, a lot of statistical sort of websites, betting odds market, etc., do think England will do well. In the wildcard draft, I will not have as many English players, such as, the 5 maximum that you can go for. I still think it makes sense to have a well-rounded draft. I'm not going to overinvest into England. I think if there's any team you should really be stretching towards 4 to 5 players for, if we filter by just the semifinals here, clearly the expectations are going to be geared towards these Dutch players and obviously these English players, just because their matchup is quote unquote easier. Although, as I said, once again, I completely understand someone who doesn't understand or doesn't even want to believe, for example, that England will have an easy time for Switzerland. I do think, of course, as you can see, it's not as easy a fixture, but it's still technically less of a 50-50 on paper than the other side of the bracket, which means probably it still makes sense to invest a little bit more heavily towards, let's say, England than Switzerland, and obviously much more heavily into the Dutch than the Turkish team. As far as the final odds, what's interesting, of course, is that you see Spain and Germany rise in estimation, and that's probably because I think the general consensus, if we thought about team strength in this tournament, is that whoever comes out of that Spain-Germany game is more than likely going to win that side of the bracket, and then, of course, whoever wins, between England and Netherlands, if we're projecting ahead, will obviously advance, with England obviously being a little bit favored compared to the Dutch when it comes to reaching the final. So you can kind of see that that's sort of the implication right now based on these odds. What is interesting is that I've been tracking these odds all throughout this tournament, and at one point Germany were actually favored over Spain, but now Spain have moved into a position where they are now more favored than Germany, and that's interesting, right? Something to definitely think about. Either way, let's actually go through towards the wildcard draft now that you have a little bit of an understanding of where the teams sit. And of course, Spain, as I said, is the team expected to come out of that tougher bracket, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we should invest into Spain too much, because once again, let's say if you have Spanish players, you're probably expecting them to do a little bit worse anyways, because the matchup is quite tough. You'd probably still expect Spain, for example, to concede as a team as they have so far versus, for example, Georgia, where they were overwhelmed, I'd say. And obviously there were a lot of counterattacks from Georgia as well, stylistically, that did seemingly hurt the Spanish defense. Anyways, as I said, going towards wildcard draft. So now moving towards the wildcard draft, we have our team selection. And of course, as I said, we do plan to invest a little bit more deeply into the Dutch team and the English team. And that's simply because we think that they have easier matchups on paper. At the same time, I think what I've tried to do over the course of this entire draft is try to pick the best players from the teams, regardless of how bad a team might do within the tournament. For example, with Turkey, unfortunately, there are no Turkey players within the selection, because I just think it's very hard to fit a Turkish player into this draft and to expect them to do well. I really do think that they'll concede to the Dutch anyways, and for that reason, not many places where I can see where investing into Turkey makes too much sense. Now, moving on, starting with the draft in the defense, the sort of team that I'd like to go for is a sort of team that is basically all ball recoveries, right? We're trying to go for players who, as has been proven so far within this tournament, are amazing for ball recoveries. And for that reason, we're going to go with, within the Dutch team, to double stack on their defense. I think you can triple stack the defense, and I definitely think you can maybe change Rudiger, for example, for another Dutch defender, potentially Dumfries. But I would go with Van Dijk and De Vrij right now. This is your 5 million and 5.5 million Dutch defenders. I still like Van Dijk because I think the minutes are there. And once again, as I said, there might be situations in games where you can clearly see that Depay will be subbed off a little bit early. This didn't happen in the most recent game, but of course that could happen because it's not like always the case that Gakpo will come off early. We've seen games where the opposite has happened, and Van Dijk obviously might get a bit of pen share there. Now, in terms of set pieces as well, we saw today Van Dijk very close, hit the post at one time. Dumfries had a great game, but in my opinion, I still think that he's going to play a relatively defensive game, and there's also a lack of ball recoveries, within the fullback positions just naturally, as we've seen over the course of this tournament. So I'd rather go with De Vrij, who actually has 9 ball recoveries within the Romania game, so a little bit of good sample size. Pepe, of course, is actually number 1 in this tournament for ball recoveries per 90 minutes played. Now, of course, he played 120 minutes, or technically, I think 110, 115 minutes in his previous match versus Slovenia, but I think being honest as well, you can just generally imply that Pepe's very, very good at ball recoveries. As long as he's fit and ready to play for this game, he should be, the first name of the team sheet just for the ball recovery aspect of the game. Akanji, brilliant as well. Definitely someone I neglected in the previous cheat sheet. That's obviously my bad, my omission, but a lot of people raised the point, and I definitely was pro Akanji even before the deadline. So Akanji definitely a good pick as well. Great ball recoveries, even versus a team like England, for example, where I expect him to potentially concede, but you don't really want to necessarily miss out in this instance. Now, the one player that I think that I've also neglected, as I said, is the option to go for a Spanish defender, for example, Lenormand. Lenormand no longer has his suspension threat. He was able to go through that Georgia game no problem, and he actually, despite scoring an own goal, actually was number 1 within the Spanish team for ball recoveries. And as I said, stylistically, when you see him and Laporte, I think it's a very similar relationship to Mark Wehi and Stones, where Stones and Laporte are definitely a little bit worse for ball recoveries, and that's just evident based on style of play and, of course, their natural pace. As far as Rudiger, just amazing for ball recoveries, man of the match in the previous game. I just think that it does make sense to just max out at ball recoveries at this point in time. We should really be expecting a lot of these teams to concede. A lot of these games are 50-50s. I will expect clean sheets to be lost, so why not just make sure that you have that insurance clause of a lot of ball recoveries regardless. And of course, if the clean sheet happens, like for example in the Rudiger game versus Denmark, which was a bitter pill to swallow for myself as someone who didn't own Rudiger, you can get rewarded for that even more so. So that's the defense. And then with the goalkeepers, I'm choosing Magnan and Pickford. Now, the reason why I'm doing that is because I think Magnan actually has the best chance out of all the goalkeepers within his side of the bracket to reach the semifinals. The reason why is because, as I said, Spain versus Germany is close to 50-50. We saw Portugal versus France was, I think, 45-55, something like that. So it's very clearly the case that France might be the team that will expectedly go towards the semifinal, but then obviously when they go to the semifinal, it might be the case that they eventually lose to the winner of Spain versus Germany. But by just getting a goalkeeper there, you have good insurance. And I think the same goes for either Pickford or if you want to go for Verbruggen as well, right? Verbruggen obviously will have good chances to get towards the semifinal. But the reason why I've gone for Pickford is because I think Pickford actually has the highest chance of making it all the way towards the finals anyways. And by the time you get to the finals, if England actually do make it there, which would still be a little bit of a shock to me, but of course, as I said, based on our understanding of the brackets, it does seem still very much plausible for England to get there. And therefore, you wouldn't have to waste a transfer in the finals for a goalkeeper. So that's why I've gone with Magnan and Pickford. And that's the defense. As far as the midfield now, moving on to that, we've gone with basically the talismans of each team as much as possible, but then also gone for some picks in teams that I think are expected to do well. So for example, with Bellingham and Simons, Xavi Simons that is, the reason why we've gone for these two players is because I do think England and the Dutch team do expectedly have the best chances of moving on within their game. So you're sort of picking in players who are within the English team, within the Dutch team, who are expected to do well. And of course, with Xavi Simons, he's been in great positions in this tournament. Had a very unfair, in my opinion, disallowed goal. Obviously, you can have a different opinion on that, and that's fine. Has been close in certain games, but no cigar as well. But has got an assist too. I just think that over the course of this sort of quarterfinal stage, the Dutch have a very good fixture, particularly attacking wise. This would be once again another opportunity for Simons to do well. And I think he's also clearly sort of set himself into the team. It's very possible as well with the Dutch team playing so well versus Romania that the minutes for players who started within that Dutch team are going to be very healthy moving onwards, because we've seen a lot of, experimentation from Koeman, and really nothing else has really worked until I think this very complete Dutch performance versus Romania. And for that reason, I think Xavi Simons does make sense as your sort of pick. You can obviously go for some of your more ball recovery based players. There are going to be players like Reinders, for example, who might be interesting to as well in terms of the minutes as well. But I've gone for Simons obviously for the attacking upside, because as I said, in this tournament so far, we haven't really seen midfielders pick up nearly as many ball recoveries as we'd expect, even for the defensive mids compared to center backs. As far as Bellingham, he's just, I think ultimately, if you have the budget to go for Bellingham and you have the chance to really invest into a team that we expect to still go far, despite their sort of poor performances, and arguably even his own poor performance up till obviously that very clutch moment, he is the one probably to go for, right? Probably better minutes at the end of the day than Saka and Foden. So therefore, we've gone with Bellingham. 2 man of the matches so far. Hard to see a draft without Bellingham, in my opinion. With Musiala, the reason why I think he's a bit of a lock now is, with Gundo giving the last penalty to Havertz, that has completely removed Gundo's penalty share, in my opinion. And you no longer really have a value, I guess, for Gundo over Musiala. If you have the budget available, I think I would always go Musiala over Gundo at this point in time. The minutes are a little bit shaky, right? We've seen Nagelsmann is someone who is very happy to substitute players when he sees fit. And I think Luis de la Fuente with Spain is exactly the same. However, I think the most interesting thing about all these teams is that out of all the midfielders that we have within the game, I do think the most attacking ones do come from Spain and Germany, in the sense that, one singular player is very, very productive. So, for example, Nico Williams is also in this draft for this reason. I think he's Spain's most productive player in the midfield position from the offensive point of view. Now, obviously, Fabian has produced more, but I think in terms of consistent chances to score, to assist, I would still put my money on Nico Williams, so therefore I'm going with Nico Williams. Musiala as well for Germany, I think, is that sort of player, particularly because the minutes are quite safe. And so that's why I've gone for the two of them. And my last midfielder to round things off is going to be Rodri. Now, you can go for Fabian Ruiz as well. You can also go for someone else from a different team, potentially, if you want to back another team for whatever reason. I think we've got plenty of good midfielders in the game at that sort of 6.5 billion price point. I've gone with Rodri once again because I do think that, as I said, he is Spain's penalty taker. This is a tougher game, so ball recoveries will be at play. And at the same time, of course, I don't think he necessarily plays that much deeper compared to Fabian to make him worse on the offensive point of view, even though Fabian has been so productive so far. I will remind, of course, that Fabian Ruiz did score off a set piece action rather, and of course, that's why he was sort of in the box. But naturally, you'll see that Spain will have a 10 like Olmo or Pedri, and they will be more advanced. And then there's a sort of double pivot structure where Rodri, of course, is sometimes a little bit deeper than Fabian, but will still pop up and advance as he does for Man City into good spots, into good locations where he can take a shot. And we've seen Rodri do it time and time again. So I do like Rodri as a pick. As I said, you can go for any other 6.5 million pick. The reason why I've kind of balanced the draft right now is, as you can see, we've got one Portugal, because I don't really expect them to come out versus France, but I think you can expect the ball recoveries. For Spain and Germany, the way I'd like to, for example, spend my cash allocated, I'd probably back Rudiger for the ball recoveries, and I expect both teams to score. So we're going to go with, the most interesting players from both Musiala, Williams, and Rodri as the sort of attacking players for Spain. When I look at, for example, some of the market odds as well, I continue to see Rodri, for example, with higher goal share compared to Fabian, and that's probably because of the expectations of the penalties as well. So that's why we've gone Rodri. As far as the forward line, I think this is quite simple to pick. You can actually go double Dutch forwards, I think, because once again, they have the easiest matchup on paper in the quarterfinals. And if you're expecting players to get to the semifinals, maybe you actually want to 5-stack the Dutch. But in this case here, I've gone for Mbappe because he still looks like the most lively player for France. I do think France will beat Portugal based on what I've seen. Now, of course, Portugal might be able to surprise us, finally find a team that clicks, but really with sort of Ronaldo continuing to start, and unfortunately as well, Pepe, who made a couple of mistakes, I do think France could maybe exploit once again some of the positions that Portugal gave players like, for example, Sesko in the previous match. And ultimately, even though France has been so timid, you can still say they're once again a super defensive team. Not necessarily amazing for the defenders, particularly since they have still conceded. But I think in a situation where, if you're expecting France to win by 1 goal, who's that going to come from? Most likely Mbappe is what I would say. And so that's why I would go with Mbappe here. And Kane, for me, once again, a little bit of a no-brainer because of how I expect Kane to advance deep into the tournament. Now, if you don't really like, for example, going for Kane, and you think, for example, the Dutch team actually has a much better chance of going deep into the tournament, I think you can replace Kane for Depay as well. Maybe you want to keep Mbappe instead. But I definitely, at this stage of the tournament, would be dropping Ronaldo. I'd be dropping Morata for the minutes, because now the minutes are more important. When Morata plays a team like Georgia for 65 minutes, you'd probably expect him to get a return there, to be quite honest, given the sort of, level of the fixture. But in that situation, he wasn't able to capitalize. So right now, I think it does make sense to drop those two sort of forwards for sure. And Gakpo, of course, has just had a brilliant tournament so far. So incisive, so decisive. And shout out, of course, to anyone who had Gakpo in the previous stage as well. But he's definitely the sort of Dutch forward that I would go with, just based on what I've seen so far. And that's going to be the wildcard draft. That does extend you to 105 million. Price rises have set into the game, so do look out for that. But I imagine some of you guys have already wildcard or used your unlimited transfers to get some players who got price rises. So I hope this draft is, very much affordable for you guys. Otherwise, I hope you guys have a wonderful week ahead and look forward to more content soon for Match Day 5, and I'll see you guys soon.